Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. It's the first video I've taken in a while, in a long while actually, over a year. A few minutes ago I tried to do the uh, live broadcast on YouTube, but then my internet cut out after I was into it for about 2 or 3 minutes. My internet's back on now, but I figured, well, I'll just try it this way and then see if maybe try the YouTube live later as well. Um, if there's anything I can do to cut down on the work required to put a video up, then that's the way to go. Um, I think the most important thing is just to make something that's interesting and has decent sound quality. After that, the visual effects are secondary. And hopefully nobody's going to come out of the house and ask me what I'm up to, but I can certainly pause it or whatever if that happens. So today I wanted to talk about one of the main, I don't know, what something I'm very interested in. That's of course relationships and marriage and all that stuff. Um, and I was thinking, like, I watch a lot of that stuff on YouTube, a lot of videos on all that marriage and dating and all that business. And in this day and age, with of course, all these new ideas about gender and and all that, I think any reasonable person, any intellectual person, has to devote some thought to it. Um, Obviously, how you approach topics like that would depend on a lot of your presuppositions, your philosophical or religious presuppositions. Um, and I can talk about that in other places, like perhaps if this is just an introductory, um, if this is just an introduction to a number of videos I want to do on this subject, then we can certainly devote devote videos to any number of topics. Like, and one could be, of course, you know, f- the influence of different philosophies on uh, on this subject, on the subject of gender and sex and all that stuff. Um, but I just want to touch on a few things, and I thought it would be interesting to frame this initial discussion in terms of uh, the ideas of marriage and sexuality that come up in a couple of the recent books I've been reading, I've read, and specifically, interestingly enough, Jane Austen. I've read Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. No, not Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility and her Northanger Abbey. Both were excellent. My first forays into Austen, and I was surprisingly delighted, pleased. I love the novels. And the initial question is, well, why would a man in his mid 40s who has, well, certain views about sexuality and so on, why would I, why would I like, why would I have anything, why would there be anything in Jane Austen's writings that would appeal to me, that would sort of get my mental machinery flowing on this topic? Um, in general, of course, Jane Austen is uh, approaching the topic from something we would consider very traditional framework. She wrote in the early 19th century. She was not Victorian. She's proto or pre-Victorian, um, and I think that sometimes people use Victorian as a sort of a catch-all to say that anything that's not modern is Victorian in terms of sexuality and so on. Um, and that's, well, certainly not the case. Okay, so when we're talking about Jane Austen, we're obviously talking about something that you could understand within the general framework of a traditionalism, and if you want to refer that as a pre-modern or Victorian, you can go ahead. It's just not sort of not technically accurate. Um, so when you think of these things, it's not very, you know, it's not very difficult to figure out, for instance, that um, your the basic the basic framework is a Christian framework of sex within marriage and uh, pre-contraception being generally available. There were things like condoms existed, but they weren't very common. Um, and the big difference is that things like the the pill brought into the conversation, and the new realities and the new possibilities that it opened up, and the great change, of course, that clinical abortions, and all the science of determining fetus viability, and different fetal um, anomalies and so on, that created a whole new landscape for abortion. So we're going back before that time, and we're going to a world where um, marriage and sex were intimately tied, and you know it would it's unhelpful to look at it from a good bad perspective. I think you should take for granted that most times the ways that people conducted themselves and the morals they brought to the conversation were reflective of the conditions under which people lived. Um, so that's not to say that objective things like slavery and the inequality of people, and all that stuff doesn't correspond to some objective moral value. I'm just saying that I think the most important thing is to understand and remember that most things are are much better comprehended within their historical context. So the idea that sex is uh, tied into marriage, that there are values attached to things like virginity, that there are values that come into play when you're talking about things like adultery, uh, premarital sex, and all that stuff, that you have to understand the conditions in which people were living. And now, of course, for Jane Austen, you're talking about a world that was pre contraception, pre abortion, um, pre Freudian, pre Darwinian, even. And so that these are important factors to come into play. Now, it's not important that you allow your moral judgment to come in place and say, well, that was a bad time. Well, that's an unlearned conception. I think even when you think of something as as wildly as wildly different from our circumstance as, for instance, Roman slavery, you say, well, slavery is wrong. Yeah, I grant that it's wrong. Um, Yet at the same time, you have to understand what it was, what it did, and the context of the Roman Empire, fragility of life, the fragility of the empire, that stuff, pre-industrial, blah blah. So, in other words, we can't. It's very unhelpful to look at Jane Austen as a victim of her time. She wasn't a victim of her time. She was a thoughtful, brilliant observer of her time, processor of her time, a commenter on her time, and I think that it would be helpful then. I think when we read literature, well, historians read literature to point out the differences. I think uh, lovers of literature um, look for the opposite. They look at what remains, what's stable, what passes from one time to another, what's true about human nature, no matter the time or the circumstance. So, what is it that we can learn from Jane Austen by way of affirmation? Like, what did she get right? What was helpful? What was clever? What was useful? And of course, in terms of the via negativa too, what did she get wrong? What was harmful? And what was she trying to teach? What was she trying to say with her writings? It would be foolish to say that her writings are simply critical of her time and place. I think most authors are critical of their time and place. Modern authors are, in certain ways, critical of different aspects of the culture around them, whether it's you're a male or female writer, an old person or a young person. You want to say something about the world, both by way of affirmation and by way of criticism. So that's an important thing as well. Now, it's interesting that Austen's worries and concerns are not our worries and concerns today. So by that I mean she wasn't she didn't write her books looking at bemoaning her circumstance. Um, there are elements of that, sure. You can look at different writers uh, being more critical of their surroundings and less critical. Um, and there, are, as I said, there's aspects of that in every work that, you know, in different ways. It's obviously very nuanced. Nobody's going to read a novel that's simply a diatribe against something. Um, Such novels are not very artistically, not very artistically charming, compelling. So a novel is good insofar as it is able to point out the complexity of life and the difficulties of different circumstances. So whether you're talking about Jane Austen talking about the virtues and vices of courtship in her time, of marriage in her time, or Dostoevsky's talking about the virtues and vices of Russian Orthodoxy, it's these are nuanced criticisms. These are nuanced accounts. Okay, so one thing when I was reading, it didn't jump out at me as much with Northanger Abbey as it did with Sense and Sensibility. That there's a real dimorphism, an unhealthy dimorphism in terms of the way that sexuality was understood at her time, and I think that frankly, we have the same unhealthy dimorphism today. So by that I mean Jane Austen's writing as a woman, experiencing and understanding sexuality as a woman does and can't do otherwise than, and male writers obviously do the opposite. And it's interesting that like one of the well, perhaps the principal villain of Sense and Sensibility is condemned for having extramarital sex, and that there's no attempt to paint it in sort of a nuance. I shouldn't say there's no attempt, but there's not a great attempt to point it in terms of nuance and so on. So, what's interesting I found at this, and I guess I was reading something else at the time. Uh, I can't remember what it was that I was reading, but basically how I was thinking about how the fact that men and women experience the courtship ritual and routine, long courtship. Women are scooped up at 16, 17, 18 by men who are often twice their age. So, in the case of sexual sensibility, it's, 30-year-olds marrying 18-year-olds. Okay, you say, well, that's not right. That's whatever. But I'm not going to look at it in terms of the way one might expect to look at it. That this is a marriage of unequals. Well, obviously, it was a marriage of unequals. 30-year-olds and 18-year-olds are not equal in just about every way, and that the reason why men had to delay marriage but not women admits of two different explanations: one on why women had to marry early, and the other on why men couldn't marry as early. And certain consequences of those facts. Now, generally, a man is supposed to be the breadwinner and so on, and until he's set up with an independent income, he can't get married. He can't get married in his own class, which is basically the only thing parents would approve of. Okay, and parents held all the money, and parents had an authority over their children, even their adult children, that isn't isn't really carried on today in any to any extent. And the way people made money, the lease of the land, most of the people that Austen writes about are landed gentry, so people who own land who lease it to others, who give and if they have enough land, they get a yearly income from that land. So whether it's £5,000 or £10,000 or what, that is a well-known point. So in every case, Austen is going to tell you how much income a man has, and she's also going to tell you how beautiful and how young the woman is. And in fact, whether she's able to bring a dowry with her, or much of a dowry with her at all, these are all important considerations. So it's not like today where we, for instance, like we would talk about um, a man's job, his career. Is he a lawyer? Is he a doctor? Or is he, you know, does he work at McDonald's? It's not about his money, like because it's basically um, one's inheritance is doesn't play as very strong a role today for a few different reasons. One, inheritance inheritances are held by the very few and the very wealthy, and number two, people live a hell of a lot longer. So even if you marry into a wealthy family, the chances are your father-in-law and mother-in-law are going to live until they're 80, and you're probably going to be 60. And if you haven't made enough money to live off by then, well, I think you don't live for your inheritance for the last couple of years of your life. So when people were dying much earlier, say at 60 or in their 50s or whatever, the idea of inheritance was obviously a more important thing. So we define ourselves nowadays as blue collar or white collar. So it's a matter of how much money you make now, not how much you have, not how much what estate you have or whatever. Um, most literature is written by the middle class rather than in the 19th century by the upper class. Okay, um, and and so and then okay, so when we take a look again at the issue of age, um, being less healthy, less in terms of nutrition and so on, women's fertile windows were briefer, and the chance of them having miscarriages uh, way higher. I always repeat that, for instance, I believe Sophia Tolstoy got pregnant, I think, 16 times, and 8 of their children survived in the adulthood, so half, 50%. And that's not too uncommon. And today, we I think we have a less realistic sense of a woman's fertility, her fertile window, um, which is a big thing that a lot of MGTOW people, men's rights people, like to point to, that a woman's fertility is virtually over by mid 30s, right? Um, and of course, feminists would want to extend that and say, no, you're fertile into your mid 40s or something. And of course, that medical interventions are key to the feminist program or whatever. I don't think that's a very realistic and helpful thing, but again, so women getting married at 16, 17, 18, um, and obviously pregnancy follows marriage immediately and repeatedly. This was the case with um, Dickens. This is the case with Tolstoy, and just about any married writer, unless they had some unusual circumstance. So, uh, when you look at so many novels of the 19th century, the 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 role of remarriage is just so common. It's hard to think of a single Dickens novel where somebody's not uh, having a second marriage. Um, it plays a bit of a role as well in Sense and Sensibility, because I think, if I remember correctly, in the end, the main character's mother, I don't know if she gets remarried, but there's some discussion of her getting remarried towards the end of the novel. And more often than not, certain characters uh, are being are have already been married. Certain of the main characters, this is their second marriage or whatever. And sometimes, so we get 40, 50-year-old men marrying 18-year-old girls. Now that hardly ever works out. I think the lesson there is that's not a great idea. But anyway, I wanted to talk about the role of the role of men in this waiting courtship. So you have men in their 30s, waiting all through their 20s to get married, and sex outside of marriage is considered sinful, seriously sinful, and practically criminal. And one thing you notice very quickly, in if you read any amount of stuff from the 19th century, is the role of of prostitution. Now, it's interesting in getting the sense of the the way that the women were and the way that the women talked amongst each other and the way that men talked amongst each other. These were two separate worlds. The women knew nothing about what what the men talked about, and for men to talk about the things they talked about in front of women would be considered horrendously inappropriate. You can see this. This is very it's very pronounced in Tolstoy, for instance, where he famously presented his fiancee shortly before during their engagement. He wrote her a letter about all of his sexual activity up to that point. Now, it's pretty obvious, just knowing Tolstoy as Tolstoy, he would have never tolerated marrying a non-virgin. Um, and he didn't look on his own non-virginity as something to brag about. He wasn't proud of it. But of course, he didn't look at male sexuality and female sexuality in exact precisely the same way. And he was right. He was right to do that. And I think that one of the things that comes across in Jane Austen, a woman who was never married, I don't know if she quite got all the things that men were hiding from the women. Now, so many people, I mean, there's obviously the whole subculture of Jane Austen fans, and put me in that too. Um, but it's a funny world, but it's almost a world where it's an unself-sustaining world. So a world where men are expected to be celibate until 30, until they get their inheritance, until they get their, rise to the rank of captain or colonel or something in the military, until they, you know, get established as a doctor in their legal practice. And a woman doesn't have to wait at all. She's barely through puberty by the time she gets married, whereas a man has been, you know, gone through this whole thing for a long time. Topics like uh, masturbation, um, extramarital affairs, and prostitution, they're alluded to by Jane Austen because they're no, some of them are alluded to by Jane Austen as ways to, in a sense, indemnify men. So bad men go to these places, these whorehouses or whatever, bordellos, whatever you want to call them, and that's a sign of a bad character. And but it's interesting how a man who can't express his sexuality in any way up until he's 30 and he marries a virgin who knows absolutely nothing about um, a male sexual drive because it's not discussed. It's not discussed in polite society. Certainly not discussed in literature. At least not any literature that anyone, any girl was allowed to read, and basically no parent would approve of. So this is what you're left with, and it's interesting that when when I studied history, the whole history of prostitution is treated in a way that it's usually from a feminist perspective, and it's treated as a thing done to women, and not exactly from the context of the burdens that civilized Christian culture was exacting, was placing on men. So I think that's an interesting thing. Now, so if we look at it today, and and if we look at it from the practice of Christians today, and I'll speak of Catholics rather than Christians in general, well, but I think it applies to any serious Christian. I think that it's a gynocentric thing. I think that uh, topics of celibacy, chastity, and so on are are again primarily driven by uh, a female norm, Now, it's something to think about. I think that like Sense and Sensibility is obviously written from a woman's perspective, and it's interesting how even authors, even male authors like Dickens, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, um, weren't allowed by society to really express that side of things. Um, so a woman's purity is allowed to be discussed and so on, but a man's experience of sexuality isn't allowed to be discussed, and you won't see it in any of those writers. Um, it's a little different, I think, when you come to the French, and especially fin de siècle French, like late 19th century French writers. I'm heavy into Proust right now, and I've been reading some different French authors, and it's a little different there. So again, when you're talking about Victorianism, you're talking about England and Anglicanism, but of course, comparisons can be made across cultures as well, whether Germany, Russia, France, or Britain. So anyway, it's interesting, and I think that we have the same blind spots. I think that maybe that's the key word of this discussion today is the role of blind spots. Now, Jane Austen had her blind spots, and female writers obviously have the blind spots with respect to male sexuality. Um, the drawing room etiquette and all the beauty of courtship and so on. I mean, women can look at that, and they do, and they say, "I wish it was the good old days." Well, in those good old days, the men, the 30-year-old men were expected to be chaste and so on, as chaste as a 16-year-old girl. And the fact that going to bordellos were so common and not discussed is kind of a funny thing. So the women with their ideals of all these heroic men in these Austen novels, the fact is they're more often visiting those bordellos than not. Um, and so even so today, it's interesting how uh, when you read modern Christian writers, watch modern Christian videos on YouTube or whatever, sexuality is still primarily viewed uh, gynocentrically. Okay, it's appropriate to discuss sexuality from a woman's experience. It's inappropriate to discuss it from a man's experience. And so this is one of those things that, of course, drive men out of the church, and they don't identify as Christians, um, despite the love and appreciation and respect they have for Christian teaching. There isn't a home for men and their experience of sexuality as there is for women. And if you don't believe me, then why do women outnumber men easily 2 to 1 in any church? Okay, so if you want to talk about the Catholic Church being patriarchy, well, it's not working very well. Okay, the priests run the place, but they run the place at the women's discretion. The women have the power because they're the ones who pay the bills, right? So when you have 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 women to men attendance at church, um, it's not a patriarchy, right? In that regard. So what are the lessons to learn? I've got children. I've got children in their 20s and teens now. What are the lessons? What are the models of sexuality in terms of if you're looking at literature? Um, as a young man, I was fascinated and drawn to Tolstoy because there was something about his view of sexuality, his depiction of the ideal woman, Natasha Rostov. There was something really compelling for me in that. And is that a model for my daughters? Is Pierre? Is he a model for my sons? I'd say yes and no. There's something we could gain from it, but it's also an incomplete picture. Male sexuality just has a uh, very small place in modern literature. Whereas if you look at, for instance, the Iliad, you know, what Achilles was getting all bent out of shape about, that's driven by a male experience of sexuality, and the writing, Plato's dialogues, are driven by male understanding of sexuality. It's not a sexuality that he hid. He didn't need to hide it from women because women couldn't read um, in those days. But now literature masks male sexuality, and even today, feminism and female experience of sexuality is freely discussed in public, whereas male sexuality isn't. Um, it's treated like it is, uh, well, frankly, disgusting. So the question is, can literature do those things? I mean, obviously, Austen couldn't. She didn't experience male sexuality, and how ought it to be treated today? Now, in my own writing, um, I try to do it. Now, we'll discuss that at other times, how I portray male sexuality in my own characters. We can discuss that in a separate article or a separate video. So, these are just some initial thoughts. What's normative? Um, what's acceptable? What's going on behind the scenes? Okay, so there's a lot going on behind the scenes of Jane Austen, and people love dressing up in the gowns and having tea and pretending to be Jane Austen. So so that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about today. Again, I watch a lot of MGTOW stuff, men's rights stuff, because I mean some of it resonates with me, but at the same time, I feel like it's missing something as well. MGTOW resentment of the woman, the female dominated discussion about sexuality and marriage is definitely something that needs to be discussed, critiqued, challenged, um, and yet at the same time, there's something beautiful in Jane Austen's world, even if it's incomplete. You know, even Tolstoy's world's incomplete, though he was striving to do something. You know, if we look at the evolution of his thought between War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and his final novel, Resurrection, there's a very different view of sexuality that is being developed. Um, I don't know Jane Austen well enough, but if she did develop in this regard, it would be no question. It would be much of a subtler kind of development than we see in Tolstoy, for instance, because in Tolstoy it was very dramatic. Um, so anyway, I just wanted to bring that up as an initial discussion point, and we'll see if it works, see if it's a good starting point, and see what we can do from here on in. You know, we could call this series something like, literature and sexuality or something like that. So anyway, I hope this video is okay. I hope the sound quality is okay. I've never filmed outside and so on. Anyway, take care, dudes. We'll talk to you soon.